I kind of agree and I kind of disagree with Fiona. I suppose what am I doing is NCE, New Civil Engineers readers, they're all really into designing, constructing, improving, maintaining, and demolishing, quite often, infrastructure. And I always say that civil engineers, what they really love doing is digging holes and putting concrete in them. I suppose that means that NIMBY attitudes, pretty much NIMBY attitudes, persuading politicians, persuading businesses, financiers, and the public, has been and is always going to be one of their biggest challenges. The UK planning system, if you believe the Conservatives this week, it's broken. It's certainly a massive challenge for these civil engineers who like digging holes and putting concrete in them. Fiona mentioned the celebrating of Victorian infrastructure, and I suppose whenever I think about and start discussing planning and the planning regimes, as in fact I did this week in the magazine, and I wrote that whenever you start thinking about this issue, there's nothing like a discussion on reform of UK planning to really reinforce the benefits of benign dictatorships, which after all is what pretty much gave us the Victorian heritage that we see all around us, because that's really when you want efficient and cost-effective planning and decision-making, that is a really great way of doing it. Benign dictatorships, you just get on with it and you get things done. And the issue, I suppose, is really quite important right now, because efficient ways of doing things is what it's going to be all about. We keep hearing from the government and the opposition that it's all about delivering a lot more for a lot less, because, well, the country hasn't got any money, really. And so that's what it's going to be all about. And getting an efficient and effective and a planning system that delivers value for every pound spent is really important. NIMBYism, though, hasn't been an awful lot of talk about that, but I'll give you a bit of background. This word NIMBYism, or NIMBY, it was invented really in the 1980s, and it was really associated with the dumping of toxic waste, or companies who wanted to try and find places to bury toxic waste. And so basically it was literally, people didn't want it in their backyard. People didn't want licensed sites in their backyard. But it really kind of took off in the late 80s by, I think it was Nicholas Ridley has been credited for really driving it. And I suppose what he did was he turned something which was, something which was arguably positive into something which was quite a negative attitude. And it was really driven down by the programme of road construction, which I suppose was not hugely popular with the public in the 80s. And I suppose, again, contrasting the 80s road building scheme to the M1, which was 50 years old last year, there was a huge difference. The M1 was celebrated, it was in demand, it was something people drove on because it was fun and it was new and people wanted it. I compare that to the schemes that, well, I started my life as a civil engineer, and I spent most of my civil engineering career designing the A259 Dymchurch to M20 Junction 11. It was a bizarre scheme because it went through a very nice part of the world, and funnily enough, it got through public inquiry. There wasn't an awful lot of need for it. There wasn't an awful lot of objection against it, but it was one of those bizarre periods of life. Anyway, the contrast then was that when M1 came along, it was something that was really in demand. We've also got lots of other things that have spawned from NIMBYism. The NIMBY, not in anyone's backyard, where people just don't want anything. You've got banana, and build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And NIMBY, which is I suppose it's reckoned to be the opposite of NIMBY, which is not against my business or industry. I build it because it'll help business. And I suppose, as Julian said, infrastructure, and like it or not, Fiona, you said yourself, the infrastructure is key, really, to our future. Actually, moving on from the Victorians and developing more and more modern infrastructure is really what is going to help the UK economy out of the current mess. And I suppose without an effective, and as I said earlier, perhaps a draconian planning system, we do run the risk of actually failing to deliver on these critical areas. And getting a more decisive regime is really a massive challenge. And we're going to have a hotbed of NIMBY, or potential NIMBY behaviour, potentially, because, as Jim said, High Speed 2 is a very, very live and very, very real project. You've got nuclear new build, which is really got cross-party support, nuclear power stations. Waste is a massive issue for us. What are we going to do with it? Incinerate it, turn it into energy. Airports. There are lots of plans out there for new runways, and that is whether it's Heathrow, whether it's Stansted, whether it's Gatwick. Roads and wind farms, of course, whether they're on out in the sea, whether they're off the shore in view of National Trust property, or whether they're on the roofs of National Trust properties, or in fact in houses in Islington. They still do create a difficult planning decision. And I thought, from my point of view, as somebody who writes for engineers and who, as I said, started his career as an engineer, in fact, I still retain my membership with the Institution of Civil Engineers, because once you've got it, they can't take it away from you. Well, they can, I suppose, but depends what I say tonight. But what engineers have to do is actually meet it head on. And I suppose one of the first places to start is to really get to grips with, and as Fiona said, really understand what people are objecting to. And a really interesting example, I suppose, I was chatting to some of the guys who are planning to build new nuclear power stations at Hinkley Point down in Cornwall. And what they were saying to me is that from their first stage of consultation, what people didn't really object to was having a nuclear power station, because that's where they work. That's what they've grown up with. That's what's in their backyard. What they did really object to was the plans that are required to go alongside that nuclear power station for new road schemes, for new housing to accommodate the workers who are going to build this project, and for all the village bypasses and additional bits and pieces that are required. So it's understanding what exactly people are objecting to. Is it the massive thing, or is it the little teeny-weeny thing which really upsets people? It is a huge political tool, and it's going to, with all these activities, it's going to get more and more of a political tool. And I suppose we are now entering a new era of massive infrastructure development, whether it's high-speed rail. And it is quite interesting that it has become a political tool, because if you think about what the issues that are going to be discussed and debated as we go into this general election, you can bet your life that transport and infrastructure are not even going to get on the radar. There are no votes in transport, there are no votes in energy, there are no votes in infrastructure at all. So, but it's interesting that it is a massive political tool, because there are a couple of things going on right now which are all about trying to resolve this issue of planning, trying to avoid NIMBYism, trying to make it fair. Make the planning process fair, and I suppose trying to, as Fiona said, to help people assert their fundamental rights. You've got the Independent Planning Commission, which the Labour Party brought in, which is all revolves around national policy statements, getting the theory right, fast-tracking planning and bringing expert opinion. And then you've got the Tories' plan revealed last week, which is for open source planning, which is going to apparently bring fundamental radical change to replace the broken system and decentralise power, giving local people a greater say in the development of their communities. And I suppose my concern with that, while I think it's great that local people have a great say, is that it is kind of offering this sort of false context, or false pretext of offering people choice, when the politicians really know that there isn't any choice for them. And I kind of feel it is a notion of local democracy in planning. It isn't really ever going to happen. It's a nonsense, and it really simply adds to the bureaucracy of getting too many people involved in the decision process. Is it a UK problem? France, an example of action in France. I heard some discussion last week by the city of Lille, and they reminded me that 45 million euros was paid to ensure that they had a high-speed rail line through their city, and they've really reaped the benefits of it ever since. Spain is really ploughing ahead with its high-speed network because it links up the country and enables people to do business. China, there's a massive amount of really big infrastructure going on there, and it does take very little time, perhaps because of as I said at the start, a very efficient way of planning that they've got going on over there. But it is a bigger country. We are, as Fiona says, we are quite a small country, and we have got a culture of the Englishman's home being his castle. We have a love of owning our homes, and we have a love of our properties, which is an interesting contrast. I spent a lot of time in France, and the French love the concept of living in new houses as opposed to old houses, which maybe is a huge cultural difference, which means if you pay them enough money, they will move out of their old house and go and live in a brand new one. So there is some really huge differences, but I think political leadership and vision is the key, whether you're in Lille, or you're in Spain, or whether you're talking about the high-speed rail line. Political leadership and vision is a really, really vital part, and perhaps something which, in this country, that's what our cultural problem is. Engineers are not very good, I suppose, also at selling the benefits of infrastructure. They're not very good at mobilising visionary politicians. High-speed 1, the Channel Tunnel rail link, came about because of the political vision and leadership of the strange bedfellows of Heseltine and Prescott. I suppose who are those visionary leaders who are going to drive us out, drive the projects of the future? Well, they don't really exist because everyone is too busy engaging the local communities. There is also a historic, I suppose, by engineers, a historic fear of passion. And as Jim really kind of underlines for me, conveniently, it isn't about cost-benefit ratios. Of course it's about cost-benefit ratios for engineers, but for people it's about lives. And I suppose engineers really run into a lot of trouble because they get too stuck on cost-benefit ratios. 3.5 to 1. That's great, isn't it? What's it going to do to my life? And I suppose passion is really good news for engineers. Passion is really good and positive for this whole debate. But what is bad is poor planning, poor construction and poor development in the past. And I suppose the protest movement of the 1990s against roads, that spawned swampies, etc., really showed that you can win some battles as an engineer, but really lose the entire war. And I suppose we've really got to make sure that when we're setting our policy statements now, we actually make sure we're winning the war as well. Get the design right, as Jim really pointed out, and get the design right, as Fiona says, and then we'll get things right, and then compensate people properly for it. I suppose High Speed 1, once they got going, there were no objections. Once the project got going, they planned it properly, there were no objections, no properties, no one really caused a big fuss because they did the planning properly. Can we turn NIMBY into another one? Was it YIMBY? Is that allowed? I don't know. Yes, in my backyard. That is a big challenge, I suppose. But I think you really have to switch the focus of debate. When you talk about nuclear power, well, what's the combination of new nuclear compared to nuclear decommissioning? If your job revolves around a nuclear power station and it's being closed down, then a new nuclear power station for you is a blooming good thing because it means you're going to have a job. What about high-speed rail? Let's talk about transport. Let's talk about getting from A to B. But let's also talk about the fact that high-speed rail doesn't just create a transport network. It is actually a regeneration spur. What it does is it creates economies that weren't there before. In the case of high-speed rail, it puts Birmingham within 45 minutes of London, and that creates huge opportunities for business. It rules out options that maybe putting extra runways in at Heathrow. It changes the paradigm. Tidal power, what does it do for communication and leisure? Housing, what about community development? And I suppose you have to shift the way you're thinking about the developments in infrastructure. And I suppose if someone said to me just today, good planning should be really focused around the creation of happiness in people's lives as opposed to the creation of wealth. Thank you very much.